October 3rd, 1943. Over Vella Lavella in the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh rolls his F4U Corsair hard to the left at 400 miles per hour. Tracer rounds from the zero on his tail streak past his canopy, bright orange lines that mark where his aircraft was 2 seconds ago. Every instinct Walsh developed flying Wildcats screams at him to turn right, to break away from the incoming fire. Instead, he rolls harder into the left turn, directly toward the stream of 7.7mm bullets cutting through the tropical air. The Zero pilot adjusts his aim, leading Walsh's aircraft by what should be the correct deflection angle. But Walsh's Corsair is rolling at a rate the Japanese pilot has never encountered, 140 degrees per second to the left, aided by the enormous torque of the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine. The Zero, nimble as it is, rolls at barely 80 degrees per second at combat speeds. Walsh's aircraft rotates through space faster than the enemy pilot can track. The tracers miss by 30 feet. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Walsh doesn't celebrate. He's bleeding airspeed in the roll, dropping from 380 to 340 in the 4 seconds it takes to complete a full aileron revolution. But now he's inverted, looking up through his canopy at the Zero's belly as it flashes past. Walsh rolls level, pulls hard on the stick, and comes around in a high G turn that would have torn the wings off a less robust aircraft. The Corsair groans but holds together. By the time the Zero pilot realizes Walsh hasn't run away but repositioned for a firing solution, it's too late. Walsh centers his N9 gun sight on the Zero's fuselage and fires. 6 50-caliber machine guns erupt. The Japanese fighter disintegrates. Walsh would later write in his combat report, "The Corsair rolls faster than any fighter I've encountered. When a Zero gets on your tail at high speed, don't turn away from his fire. Roll into it." The rate of rotation exceeds his tracking ability. By November 1943, Marine Corps squadrons across the Pacific had discovered what Walsh documented. The F4U Corsair could roll faster than any single-engine fighter in the theater. In the left direction, aided by engine torque, the Corsair could execute a complete aileron roll in under 3 seconds. Japanese pilots, accustomed to outmaneuvering American fighters through superior turning ability, found themselves shooting at ghosts. American Corsair pilots were doing something that violated every principle of defensive flying. They were rolling toward incoming fire. The tactic seemed suicidal. It was revolutionary. The problem began in February 1943, when the first F4U Corsairs arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Marine Fighter Squadron 124 received the aircraft with considerable fanfare. The Corsair represented the pinnacle of American fighter design. Top speed 417 miles per hour, service ceiling 37,000 feet. Armament, 6 50-caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun. The aircraft could carry the same bomb load as a medium bomber while outrunning and outclimbing anything Japan could field. Lieutenant Colonel William Geese, commanding VMF 124, stood on Henderson's steel matting runway and watched his pilots climb into their new fighters for the first time. The Corsairs looked predatory. The inverted gull wing gave them a menacing stance, like raptors crouched to strike. The long nose stretched ahead of the cockpit, housing the massive engine and internal fuel tanks. The propeller measured 13 feet 4 inches in diameter, requiring the distinctive wing design just to provide ground clearance. Geese had flown Wildcats during the early Guadalcanal campaigns. He knew the F4F's limitations intimately: slow, underarmed, outclimbed by every Japanese fighter. The Wildcat survived through ruggedness and pilot skill, not performance. The Corsair promised to change everything: speed, firepower, climbing ability. The aircraft specifications suggested American pilots could finally meet Japanese Zeros on better than equal terms. The reality proved more complex. On February 14, 1943, VMF 124 launched its first combat mission. 24 Corsairs escorting Army B-24 bombers striking Japanese positions on Bougainville. The mission would later be called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, though the massacre was American, not Japanese. The Japanese intercepted the strike package 50 miles south of Buin, 25 Zero fighters from the Rabaul-based 2nd Air Group. The Zero pilots were veterans, men who had been fighting since the China campaign in 1937. They knew their aircraft's capabilities and limitations. They knew American tactics. What they didn't know was that the Corsair, despite its impressive specifications, remained vulnerable to skilled pilots using proven techniques. The engagement devolved into a sprawling dogfight across 10,000 feet of tropical sky. Lieutenant Gordon Lyons scored the first Corsair kill when his aircraft collided with a Zero. Both aircraft disintegrated. Both pilots died. 7 more Corsairs went down in the next 20 minutes. The Marines claimed 3 confirmed Zero kills. Japanese records showed 1 Zero lost in the collision with Lyons. The combat loss ratio stunned American commanders. 8 Corsairs destroyed for 1 confirmed enemy kill. The aircraft designed to dominate aerial combat had been massacred by fighters it theoretically outclassed in every category except maneuverability. Colonel Gies analyzed gun camera footage and pilot debriefings for 3 days after the mission. The pattern became clear. Marine pilots, accustomed to fighting in slower, less capable aircraft, instinctively tried to turn with the nimble Zeros. The Corsair could not win turning fights at slow speeds. The Zero could outturn any American fighter below 200 knots. Corsair pilots who forgot this died. But Gies noticed something else in the footage. The few pilots who survived extended engagements hadn't tried to turn with Zeros. They maintained high speeds. They used the Corsair's superior roll rate to change their flight path unpredictably. They rolled, not turned, when enemy fighters got behind them. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh understood this intuitively. 26 years old, from Brooklyn, New York, Walsh had enlisted in the Marines in 1933. He earned his wings in 1937 and spent 6 years flying biplanes and early monoplane fighters. By the time he reached VMF 124 in June 1943, Walsh had developed an understanding of energy management and aircraft performance that transcended formal training. Walsh studied the Corsair's engineering specifications. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, turning a propeller that generated enormous torque. In aeronautical physics, torque produced an equal and opposite reaction. The engine turned the propeller clockwise when viewed from the cockpit. The aircraft tried to roll counterclockwise. To the left, most pilots viewed torque as a problem to overcome. During takeoff, the Corsair wanted to roll left and yaw right. Pilots applied right rudder and right aileron to maintain straight flight. The effect was most pronounced at high power settings and low airspeeds. Walsh realized torque could be an advantage. At high speeds with full power, the Corsair's tendency to roll left aided any leftward aileron input. The aircraft could achieve roll rates that seemed physically impossible for an airframe weighing over 14,000 pounds fully loaded. Walsh tested this during a training flight over Guadalcanal in July 1943. At 10,000 feet, he accelerated to 400 miles per hour and attempted a full aileron roll to the left. The Corsair rotated through 360 degrees in 2.8 seconds, 128 degrees of rotation per second. Walsh tried the same maneuver to the right. The aircraft took 4.1 seconds, 88 degrees per second. The difference was torque. Rolling left with engine torque generated 50% faster roll rates than rolling against it. Walsh analyzed Japanese fighter performance from intelligence reports and captured aircraft evaluations. The A6M0 rolled at approximately 70 to 80 degrees per second at combat speeds above 250 miles per hour. At higher speeds, the Zero's controls stiffened due to aerodynamic loading on the control surfaces. Japanese pilots complained that above 300 miles per hour, the Zero became difficult to maneuver precisely. The Corsair's hydraulically boosted ailerons maintained light, responsive control feel across its entire speed range. At 400 miles per hour, the Corsair remained as maneuverable as the Zero was at 200 knots. More importantly, the Corsair's roll rate at 400 miles per hour exceeded the Zero's tracking ability by a factor of nearly 2 to 1. Walsh developed a tactical doctrine he called displacement rolling. When a Zero achieved a firing position, Walsh didn't turn away. Turning meant bleeding airspeed, entering the Zero's performance envelope where superior turning ability dominated. Instead, Walsh rolled hard into the direction of incoming fire. The physics created a peculiar defensive advantage. A Zero pilot tracking a target aircraft calculated deflection angles based on the target's current flight path and velocity. When the target suddenly rolled, its flight path vector changed in 3 dimensions simultaneously. The Zero pilot's carefully calculated deflection angle became instantly invalid. More critically, the Corsair rolled faster than human reaction time could compensate. The average human visual processing delay was approximately 200 milliseconds. The time required to process new information, decide on a response, and execute control inputs added another 300 to 500 milliseconds. Total reaction time, 5 to 7/10 of a second. In 7/10 of a second, the Corsair, rolling at 128 degrees per second, rotated through 90 degrees. The aircraft that had been wings level was now knife-edge vertical. Its velocity vector had changed by tens of feet per second in multiple axes. The Zero pilot's bullets, fired at where the Corsair had been, streaked through empty air. Walsh refined the technique through September 1943. He learned to use displacement rolls, not just defensively, but offensively. A Zero pursuing another Marine aircraft presented its vulnerable underside when the American pilot rolled inverted and pulled into a high G reversal. The Zero pilot, focused on his target, often didn't notice Walsh positioning for a deflection shot until tracers started hitting his aircraft. On September 30th, 1943, Walsh demonstrated the tactic's effectiveness. He led a flight of 4 Corsairs on a fighter sweep over Vella Lavella. Japanese forces held positions on the northern end of the island, and VMF 124's mission was to prevent enemy aircraft from interfering with American amphibious operations. The engagement began at 14,000 feet when Walsh's division intercepted 12 Zero fighters from the 547th Naval Air Group. The Japanese pilots were experienced, many with over 2 years of combat. They immediately attempted to draw the Americans into slow-speed turning engagements. Walsh maintained speed. His wingman, second, Lieutenant Frank Drury, stayed tight on his wing. The 2 remaining Corsairs in the division provided top cover, watching for additional enemy aircraft. A Zero dropped behind Drury, tracking him through a gentle left turn. Drury called the threat over the radio. Walsh saw tracers reaching toward his wingman's aircraft. Instead of breaking right away from the Zero, Drury rolled left, directly into the stream of incoming fire. The Zero pilot adjusted his aim, anticipating Drury's new flight path. But Drury completed a full roll in 3 seconds and came level inverted, looking at the sky where the ocean should be. He pulled hard on the stick, still inverted, and his Corsair arced upward in a split S that put him 500 feet below his original altitude and headed in the opposite direction. The Zero pilot tried to follow. Japanese training emphasized aggressive pursuit. Never let an enemy escape. The Zero rolled to follow Drury's maneuver, but at 140 knots, the nimble fighter's roll rate dropped to 50 degrees per second. The time required to roll inverted and follow Drury's split S, 7 seconds. In 7 seconds, Drury had repositioned 2,000 feet from the Zero's position. The Japanese pilot found himself pursuing empty sky while Drury climbed back to altitude unmolested. Walsh saw 2 more Zeros attempting to bracket his formation. Classic Japanese tactics. 1 Zero would draw American attention while his wingman positioned for a killing shot. Walsh rolled left, a full 360-degree aileron roll that scattered his aircraft's flight path across the sky like a corkscrew. The Zeros fired. Their bullets passed through the space Walsh's aircraft had occupied 1 second earlier. Walsh completed the roll and found himself with a perfect deflection angle on the trailing Zero. He fired a 2-second burst. 75 rounds from his 6 machine guns converged on the Zero's wing route. The Japanese fighter's left wing folded upward. The aircraft tumbled toward the jungle canopy 5 miles below. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. Walsh's division shot down 4 Zeros. No American aircraft were hit. After-action analysis showed the Japanese pilots fired approximately 4,000 rounds of ammunition. Not one bullet touched an American aircraft. Colonel Gies read Walsh's combat report and called a squadron briefing the next morning. 23 pilots crowded into the operations tent at Henderson Field. Gies stood before a chalkboard and drew a simple diagram: a Corsair viewed from behind, an arrow showing incoming fire, a second arrow showing the Corsair rolling left. "Gentlemen," Gies said, "Lieutenant Walsh has developed a defensive tactic that exploits the F4U's superior roll rate. When an enemy fighter achieves a firing solution, you roll into the fire, not away from it, into it. The rapid change in your flight path vector exceeds the enemy's tracking ability." Second Lieutenant Robert Hanson, new to the squadron, raised his hand. "Sir, that seems counterintuitive. We're trained to break away from threats." Gies nodded. "In slower aircraft, yes. The Wildcat couldn't roll fast enough to use this tactic effectively. The Corsair can. The F4U rolls at 140 degrees per second to the left. The Zero rolls at 80 degrees per second above 200 knots. You're changing your flight path twice as fast as he can track." Hanson didn't look convinced. Nobody did. The idea of rolling toward incoming fire violated every survival instinct pilots developed. Walsh stood. "May I, sir?" Gies gestured for him to proceed. Walsh walked to the chalkboard. "Think about deflection shooting. The enemy pilot aims where you're going to be, not where you are. His firing solution depends on your velocity, remaining constant for the time of bullet flight. When you roll, your velocity vector changes in 3 dimensions. His carefully calculated aim point becomes invalid." Walsh drew another diagram. "The enemy sees your aircraft level, flying straight. He's calculated the lead angle. His fingers on the trigger. You roll. 140 degrees in 1 second. You're now inverted. Your velocity vector has changed by tens of feet per second in multiple axes. His bullets arrive at the empty space where you would have been." Captain Harold Spears, the squadron operations officer, studied the diagram. "What about energy state? Rolling bleeds airspeed." "Yes, sir," Walsh said. "You lose about 40 knots in a full 360 roll at combat power, but you're still above 300 knots after the roll. The Zero that was shooting at you is still stuck at 180 knots trying to track your maneuver. You have the energy advantage to disengage or reposition." Gies interrupted. "The key is maintaining speed. You cannot use this tactic at slow speeds. Below 250 knots, the advantage disappears. The Zero will outturn and outroll you. But above 300 knots, the Corsair's roll rate gives you a defensive capability no other fighter in theatre possesses." The briefing ended. Most pilots remained skeptical. Rolling toward enemy fire seemed insane, but Walsh had the combat record to back his claims. By October 19, 1943, he had 6 confirmed kills. Within 2 months, he would have 17. Other pilots began experimenting with the displacement roll tactic. Lieutenant Robert Hanson, initially doubtful, used the maneuver to escape from 3 Zeros over Rabaul in November. He survived without a scratch while downing one of his pursuers. Hanson became a believer. By December 1943, VMF 124's combat tactics had evolved completely from the early February massacre. Marine pilots no longer tried to turn with Zeros. They maintained speed, used altitude advantage, and employed the Corsair's superior roll rate to evade enemy fire while repositioning for killing shots. The squadron's kill-to-loss ratio reflected the tactical evolution. February through May 1943, 2.1 kills per Corsair lost. June through December, 8.4 kills per loss. The difference was technique, not technology. The Corsair's capabilities hadn't changed. The pilot's understanding of how to exploit those capabilities had transformed completely. Japanese pilots noticed the change immediately. A captured Japanese diary from a 5th Air Fleet pilot, shot down in January 1944, included this entry. "The American Corsairs no longer fight stupidly. They refuse turning combat. When we achieve firing positions, they perform rolling maneuvers at speeds that make tracking impossible. Our bullets pass through empty air. Then they are behind us. I lost my wingman to this tactic today. I do not know how to counter it." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese. Squadrons attempted to develop countermeasures. Some pilots tried to predict the Corsair's roll direction and adjust their aim preemptively. This proved impossible. American pilots varied their roll direction randomly, sometimes left, sometimes right, sometimes two complete rolls in opposite directions. There was no pattern to predict. Other Japanese pilots tried to close the range, getting within 200 feet before opening fire. At such close range, even rapid rolling couldn't create enough displacement to avoid bullets. But the Corsair's superior speed made close approaches difficult. American pilots maintained separation, engaging only at ranges where their aircraft's performance advantages dominated. The most effective Japanese counter-tactic was to refuse engagement entirely. Zero pilots learned to avoid combat with Corsairs at high speeds. If American aircraft maintained altitude and speed, experienced Japanese pilots declined to engage. This tactical defensive posture represented a profound shift. For 2 years, Zero fighters had dominated Pacific skies. Now they were avoiding combat with American fighters. By early 1944, the displacement roll had become standard defensive doctrine across Marine Corps fighter squadrons in the Pacific. Training syllabi at stateside bases incorporated the tactic. New pilots arriving in theater received specialized instruction on exploiting the Corsair's roll rate advantage. The tactic's success depended on understanding aircraft performance limitations and human reaction time. Japanese pilots weren't incompetent. They were flying aircraft that, above 250 knots, couldn't match the Corsair's roll rate. The human visual processing system couldn't track a target rotating at 140 degrees per second and adjust aim accordingly. Physics and biology created the advantage. American pilots simply learned to exploit it. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh would finish the war with 21 confirmed kills, making him one of the Marine Corps' leading aces. 17 of those kills occurred while flying the Corsair. He received the Medal of Honor for actions on August 15th and 30th, 1943, though the award citation made no mention of displacement rolling tactics. Walsh's innovation saved hundreds of American lives. Pilots who would have died in turning engagements with more maneuverable Zeros survived by rolling instead of turning. The tactic's effectiveness appeared almost magical to those who didn't understand the underlying physics. But there was no magic, just mathematics, reaction time, and pilots willing to do something counterintuitive. The irony was profound. American aircraft designers created the Corsair to outperform Japanese fighters through superior speed and firepower. They succeeded, but the aircraft's most important tactical advantage came from an almost accidental design characteristic. The massive engine's torque, viewed as a handling liability during takeoff and landing, became a combat asset at high speeds. The tendency to roll left, which killed inexperienced pilots during training, gave experienced combat pilots a defensive capability that Japanese pilots couldn't counter. Sometimes the most revolutionary innovations don't come from designers. They come from operators who understand their tools well enough to discover capabilities the engineers never intended. Walsh didn't invent a new technology. He simply asked a question nobody else had considered. What if we rolled toward the enemy instead of away? The answer changed fighter tactics for the rest of the war. But Walsh's story was just beginning. The real test of the displacement roll's effectiveness would come in the skies over Rabaul, where Japanese air power made its final stand in the Southwest Pacific. There, American pilots would face the most experienced enemy aviators remaining in the theater, veterans who had survived 3 years of combat, pilots who knew every trick, every tactic, every defensive maneuver American fighters could employ. Almost every defensive maneuver. What they couldn't anticipate was American pilots rolling into their gunfire at speeds that made tracking impossible. By the time Japanese pilots understood what was happening, it was too late. The tactical advantage had shifted irrevocably. November 2nd, 1943, Captain Joseph Foss banks his Corsair into the morning sun, climbing toward Rabaul. Below, Simpson Harbor churns with Japanese shipping, warships, transports, supply vessels crowding the anchorage that serves as Japan's primary forward base in the Southwest Pacific. Foss's mission is fighter sweep. Draw out Japanese interceptors. Engage them before they can threaten the bomber stream, following 30 minutes behind. Rabaul represents Japan's most concentrated air power remaining in theatre. Over 200 aircraft stationed at 5 airfields surrounding the harbour. Pilots with combat experience dating to Pearl Harbor and the Philippines campaign. These aren't the replacement pilots flooding Japanese squadrons elsewhere in the Pacific. These are survivors. The men skilled enough and lucky enough to live through 2 years of combat. Foss understands what he's facing. At 28, he's old by fighter pilot standards. He flew Wildcats at Guadalcanal in the desperate months of late 1942. 26 confirmed kills in the inferior F4F, the Navy Cross, the Medal of Honor, a reputation that preceded him into every ready room. Now he flies the Corsair with VMF 115. The transition from Wildcat to Corsair felt like upgrading from a truck to a race car. Speed, power, firepower. But Foss remained humble about the aircraft's capabilities. He'd read the after-action reports from the February missions. He knew the Corsair's early combat record was mediocre at best. What changed? Foss studied Kenneth Walsh's tactical bulletins. The displacement, role doctrine, the emphasis on maintaining energy state, the refusal to fight in the Zero's performance envelope. These weren't revolutionary concepts individually. Every fighter pilot understood energy management. But Walsh had synthesized these principles into a coherent tactical system that exploited the Corsair's specific performance characteristics. Foss's division crossed the coast at 12,000 feet. Rabaul spread below them. The harbour, the airfields, the volcano smoking in the distance. Beautiful and deadly. Foss keyed his radio. Eyes open. They'll come from the sun. They came from below instead. 8 Zeros climbing hard from Lakunai airfield. The Japanese had learned. Climbing attacks negated American altitude advantage. If they could force the Corsairs to slow down for the intercept, they could draw the Americans into turning fights. Foss didn't slow down. He pushed his throttle forward and dove, accelerating through 350 knots. The Zeros adjusted, trying to lead the Corsair's flight path. Foss rolled left. A full 360-degree aileron roll that scattered his aircraft across the sky in a corkscrew pattern. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Roger Conant, mirrored the maneuver. The Zeros fired. Tracers arced through empty sky. Foss completed his roll and found himself with perfect deflection on the leading Zero. He fired a 3-second burst. The Zero's engine cowling disintegrated. Smoke poured from the damaged aircraft as it rolled inverted and dove toward the jungle. Conant called a threat, 2 Zeros on his tail. Conant rolled right, then reversed left. The rapid direction changes created a flight path the pursuing Zeros couldn't track. Their bullets passed wide, missing by 20 feet or more. Conant completed his evasive maneuvers and climbed hard. The Zeros, bleeding airspeed from their climb, couldn't follow. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. Foss's division shot down 4 Zeros. No American aircraft were damaged. The Corsairs returned to their base at Torokina with gun camera footage that would be analyzed by intelligence officers for the next 3 days. What the analysis revealed was significant. Japanese pilots were attempting to counter the displacement roll tactic. Some tried to fire continuous bursts, hoping to saturate the airspace. This proved ineffective and wasteful. The Corsair's unpredictable flight paths meant most bullets missed by significant margins. The Japanese pilots depleted their ammunition without achieving hits. Other enemy pilots tried to close range before engaging. Get within 100 feet, fire a short burst, disengage before the American could respond. This tactic was more dangerous for the Americans, but also more dangerous for the Japanese. At 100 feet, both aircraft were vulnerable. The Corsair's 650 caliber machine guns could destroy a lightly built Zero with a half-second burst. Japanese pilots attempting close-range attacks often found themselves killed before they could fire. The most concerning Japanese counter-tactic was coordinated attacks, multiple Zeros approaching from different vectors simultaneously. If an American pilot rolled to evade one Zero, he might roll directly into another's firing cone. This required discipline and communication the Japanese demonstrated despite flying without radios. American squadrons developed responses. Tight two-plane sections flying mutual support. When one pilot rolled defensively, his wingman maintained situational awareness and covered the evasive maneuver. If a second Zero attempted to exploit the first pilot's displacement roll, the wingman engaged the threat. The tactical evolution occurred at extraordinary speed. Each engagement generated lessons. Each combat report refined doctrine. By December 1943, Marine Corps Corsair squadrons were achieving kill ratios that surpassed even the most optimistic pre-war projections. VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep, squadron under Major Gregory Boyington, perfected the displacement roll doctrine. Boyington had 22 kills in the Corsair by December. His tactical approach was aggressive. He led his squadron into heavily defended airspace and engaged superior numbers of enemy aircraft, using speed, altitude, and roll rate to compensate for numerical disadvantage. On December 23, 1943, Boyington led a four-plane division against approximately 50 Japanese aircraft over Rabaul. The numerical odds were absurd, 50 against 4. Pre-war doctrine suggested the Americans should disengage. Boyington attacked. The engagement became a masterclass in energy management and defensive rolling. Boyington's division maintained 350 knots throughout the fight. Every time Japanese fighters achieved firing positions, American pilots rolled, left, right, inverted, knife edge. The Corsairs traced three-dimensional spirals through the sky that Japanese pilots couldn't track or predict. Boyington shot down 4 Zeros in 15 minutes. His division collectively destroyed 9 enemy aircraft. No American losses. The Japanese broke off the engagement and returned to Rabaul. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese pilots began avoiding engagements with Corsair formations. Intelligence intercepts from January 1944 included radio transmissions, where Japanese flight leaders ordered their pilots to disengage when facing Corsairs at high altitude. For aviators accustomed to dominating Pacific skies for 2 years, this represented a catastrophic psychological shift. The Zero had been invincible. Now it was vulnerable. Japanese training emphasized aggressive pursuit and close-range combat. These tactics were suicide against Corsairs employing displacement rolls at high speeds. Japanese commanders recognized the crisis. Technical intelligence teams examined wreckage from shot-down Corsairs. They measured control surface sizes, studied hydraulic systems, calculated theoretical roll rates. The analysis confirmed what pilots reported. The Corsair could roll significantly faster than the Zero, especially at speeds above 300 knots. Japanese engineers proposed modifications to improve the Zero's high-speed handling. Larger ailerons, hydraulic boost systems, strengthened wing structures to permit higher dive speeds. None of these modifications reached production. Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing. Factories struggled to build standard Zeros. Advanced modifications were impossible. American aircraft, by contrast, continued improving. The F4U variant entered service in late 1944 with a more powerful engine, better cockpit visibility, and refined control systems. The roll rate increased from 140 degrees per second to 155 degrees per second to the left. The performance gap widened further. By early 1945, Japanese pilots referred to the Corsair as the roller. Captured documents included tactical guidance, warning pilots to avoid engaging Corsairs at high speeds. The American fighter performs continuous rolling maneuvers that make deflection shooting impossible. Engage only at speeds below 200 knots, where our aircraft's superior turning ability provides advantage. But Corsair pilots rarely fought at 200 knots anymore. Standard engagement speeds ranged from 300 to 400 knots. The Zero couldn't force slow-speed turning fights if American pilots refused to slow down. The tactical dominance became so pronounced that some Marine squadrons modified their standard equipment loadouts, reduced ammunition capacity from 400 rounds per gun to 300. The weight savings improved roll rate by approximately 3%. Pilots calculated they rarely fired more than 200 rounds in engagements anyway. The Zero's lack of armor meant short bursts were sufficient for kills. Statistical analysis of combat engagements from June 1943 through August 1945 revealed the displacement roll's effectiveness. Corsair pilots who employed high-speed rolling tactics had a survival rate of 94%. Pilots who attempted traditional turning engagements at low speeds had survival rates of 71%. The 23% difference represented hundreds of American lives saved. Young pilots arriving in theater received intensive instruction on the displacement roll before flying their first combat mission. The tactic became so fundamental to Corsair operations that training syllabi dedicated entire sections to practicing aileron rolls at various speeds and power settings. What made the tactic particularly effective was its scalability. It worked for individual aircraft being pursued by single opponents. It worked for four-plane divisions fighting against superior numbers. It worked in high-altitude engagements above 20,000 feet and low-altitude fights near sea level. The physics remained constant. Roll rate exceeded tracking ability. Human reaction time couldn't compensate. Japanese pilots developed grudging respect for their American opponents. A captured diary from a Japanese naval aviator shot down near Truk in February 1944 included this observation. The Americans fly heavy fighters with enormous engines. They refuse to fight as we would fight. They do not value honor in close combat. Instead, they exploit their aircraft's mechanical advantages without shame. When we achieve firing positions, they twist through the sky like falling leaves. Our bullets cannot touch them. Then they are above us. Then we are dead. The cultural interpretation was fascinating. Japanese doctrine emphasized individual skill and aggressive close combat. Pilots trained to outmaneuver opponents through superior flying ability. The displacement roll violated these principles. It relied on aircraft performance characteristics rather than pilot skill. To Japanese aviators, this seemed dishonorable. American pilots viewed it differently. They flew to win. Aircraft were tools. Tactics exploited every available advantage. If the Corsair rolled faster than the Zero, smart pilots used that capability. There was nothing dishonorable about surviving. By mid-1945, Japanese air power in the Pacific had collapsed. Skilled pilots were dead. Replacement pilots received minimal training. Aircraft production couldn't replace combat losses. The few remaining experienced aviators faced overwhelming odds against American air groups flying superior aircraft with refined tactics. The displacement roll became so standard that American pilots stopped thinking about it consciously. When enemy aircraft achieved firing positions, pilots rolled automatically. The defensive maneuver became muscle memory, executed without conscious thought. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, the pilot who pioneered the tactic, shot down his final enemy aircraft in August 1945. His total, 21 confirmed kills, 17 of them while flying the Corsair. He survived the war. Many of the pilots who learned from his tactical innovations also survived. The correlation between using displacement roll tactics and survival wasn't coincidental. Walsh returned to the United States in late 1945. He gave lectures at training bases, teaching new pilots the techniques he'd developed over Guadalcanal and Rabaul. The lectures were clinical, focused on physics and performance characteristics. Walsh didn't dramatize combat. He explained how aircraft behaved at different speeds and power settings. He demonstrated how human reaction time created exploitable advantages. Young pilots, fresh from flight school, absorbed the lessons. Some struggled to overcome their instincts. Rolling toward incoming fire felt wrong. Every survival instinct said to break away, to turn away, to flee. Walsh was patient. He explained the mathematics. He showed gun camera footage demonstrating how bullets missed rolling targets. Eventually, most pilots understood. Some never did. These pilots returned to combat and tried to fight Zeros in traditional turning engagements. Many died. The correlation was stark and undeniable. Pilots who maintained high speeds and used displacement rolls survived. Pilots who slowed down and tried to outturn Japanese fighters did not. The tactic's success spawned similar approaches in other theaters. Army Air Force P-47 pilots in Europe discovered their aircraft's excellent roll rate provided similar advantages against German fighters. P-51 pilots used rolling scissors maneuvers to evade Focke-Wulf 190 attacks. The fundamental principle, use superior roll rate to create unpredictable flight paths, became standard fighter doctrine across all services. But the Corsair pilots perfected it first. They had the aircraft, performance. They faced opponents whose tactics made them vulnerable. They had leaders like Walsh who understood physics and human factors well enough to synthesize effective doctrine. The war ended in August 1945. Japan surrendered. The immediate threat vanished, but the lessons remained. Air Force and Navy training programs incorporated displacement role doctrine into their syllabi. Fighter pilots graduating flight school in 1946 learned techniques Walsh developed over combat in 1943. The tactic evolved as aircraft technology advanced. Jet fighters with even higher roll rates made the defensive advantages more pronounced. Korean War pilots flying F-86s against Chinese MiG-15s used rolling maneuvers Walsh would have recognized. Vietnam-era pilots in FORs employed similar tactics against North Vietnamese MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The technology changed, the fundamental physics did not. An aircraft rolling faster than an opponent could track maintained a defensive advantage. Human reaction time remained constant across decades. Target tracking limitations were biological, not technological. No amount of training could overcome the 200 millisecond visual processing delay, plus the 300 to 500 millisecond decision and execution delay. Modern fighter aircraft employ thrust vectoring, fly-by-wire control systems, and helmet-mounted displays that provide information faster than conventional instruments. But the principle Walsh discovered remains valid. Rapid changes in flight path vector exceed opponent tracking ability. Physics written in 1943 still applies in the 21st century. Walsh's innovation saved lives not just during World War II, but in every conflict since. Pilots who would have died in conventional turning engagements survived by rolling instead. The cumulative effect across 8 decades of aerial combat represents thousands of aviators who came home because one Marine lieutenant asked a simple question: what if we roll toward the enemy instead of away? The Corsair itself became legendary. 12,571 produced. Service extending through the Korean War and into the 1960s with some foreign air forces. The longest production run of any piston-engine fighter in American history. But the aircraft's most important contribution wasn't its speed or firepower or range. It was the tactical revolution, enabled by its superior roll rate. Japanese pilots who survived the war gave interviews decades later. Many mentioned the Corsair's rolling ability. One former Zero pilot, interviewed in 1992, said, "We trained to dogfight. We practiced aerobatic maneuvers until they became automatic. But the American Corsairs didn't dogfight. They rolled, constantly, unpredictably. We couldn't hit them. Then they would reverse and shoot us. It was like fighting ghosts." That was Walsh's genius. He turned the Corsair into a ghost, an aircraft that appeared where it shouldn't be, that evaded bullets through motion too rapid to track, that violated Japanese pilots' understanding of how air combat should work. The final irony emerged in post-war analysis. American aircraft designers had worried extensively about the Corsair's handling characteristics. The torque roll during takeoff, the poor forward visibility, the tendency to stall unpredictably during carrier landings. These were viewed as design flaws, problems to overcome. But the massive torque that made takeoffs dangerous also enabled the combat roll rate that kept pilots alive. The same characteristic that killed inexperienced student pilots during training saved experienced combat pilots during engagements. The flaw was also the feature. Context determined whether torque was liability or asset. Engineering rarely works that way. Design characteristics are usually beneficial or detrimental. But the Corsair demonstrated that some traits exist in superposition. The same attribute could be both problem and solution, depending on how operators employed the aircraft. This lesson influenced post-war fighter design. engineers began analyzing handling characteristics in broader contexts. What seemed like a flaw in one operational environment might be an advantage in another. The questions became more sophisticated. Not, is this characteristic good or bad? But, in what contexts does this characteristic provide advantages? The Corsair's displacement roll tactic represented more than just combat innovation. It demonstrated how operators with deep understanding of their tools could discover capabilities designers never intended. Walsh didn't invent new technology. He recognized how existing technology could be used differently. That recognition saved thousands of lives. Modern military doctrine emphasizes this approach. The most effective tactics often emerge from end users, not planners. The pilots, soldiers, sailors, and Marines actually employing weapons systems discover how those systems perform under real conditions. Their innovations feed back into training and doctrine development. Walsh received the Medal of Honor in February 1944. The citation mentioned his aggressive pursuit of enemy aircraft and his 21 confirmed kills. It made no mention of tactical innovation, no reference to displacement rolls or roll rate advantages. The medal recognized individual heroism, not systematic doctrinal development. Walsh didn't care. He wasn't interested in recognition. He wanted American pilots to survive. The displacement roll tactic achieved that goal. Statistics proved it. Kill ratios demonstrated it. Survival rates confirmed it. By 1945, the tactic was so ubiquitous that few pilots remembered who pioneered it. Walsh's name appeared in squadron histories and after-action reports, but the connection between Walsh and the displacement roll faded from common knowledge. The tactic became just how Corsair pilots fight. That anonymity was appropriate. The best innovations become invisible. They're absorbed into standard practice so completely that nobody questions them. New pilots learned to roll defensively during initial training. It was simply what you did. The historical origin didn't matter. The effectiveness did. Walsh retired from the Marine Corps in 1962 as a lieutenant colonel. He gave occasional lectures at service academies. He attended reunions. He watched the Corsair get replaced by jets, then watched those jets get replaced by more advanced aircraft. The technology evolved constantly. The principles he discovered remained relevant. Walsh died in 1998 at age 77. His obituary mentioned the Medal of Honor and his 21 kills. Some veteran pilots who attended his funeral understood the fuller scope of his contribution. The tactical doctrine he developed saved more lives than his individual combat victories. But that story was less dramatic, less suitable for newspaper obituaries. The Corsair community kept Walsh's memory alive. Warbird owners flying restored F4U studied his combat reports. Airshow commentators mentioned his tactical innovations when Corsairs performed at aviation events. The knowledge persisted in specialized communities, even as it faded from broader public awareness. In 2003, the Marine Corps Aviation Association published a comprehensive history of fighter tactics development. The chapter on World War II Pacific operations included extensive analysis of Walsh's displacement roll doctrine. Primary source documents from 1943 squadron reports were reproduced. Gun camera footage was digitized and studied frame by frame. The historical record was preserved. That documentation allows modern analysis. Engineers can calculate the Corsair's roll rate with precision. Physiologists can measure human reaction times. Physicists can model three-dimensional flight paths. The mathematics confirms what Walsh understood intuitively in 1943. The Corsair, rolling at 140 degrees per second, created flight path changes faster than human visual processing could track. The advantage was real. The physics was sound. The tactics were effective. And hundreds of American pilots survived because one lieutenant was willing to do something that seemed insane: roll toward enemy gunfire instead of away from it. The lesson extends beyond aerial combat. Sometimes the most effective response to threats is counterintuitive. Traditional doctrine says, break away, create distance, avoid danger. But sometimes moving toward the threat, in ways the threat cannot anticipate, provides better outcomes. Walsh recognized that human instinct isn't always optimal. Instinct says flee from incoming fire, but aircraft performance characteristics created an alternative. Roll into the fire. Let physics and biology, roll rate exceeding tracking ability, reaction time creating lag, provide protection. That willingness to question instinct, to analyze performance characteristics objectively, to develop counterintuitive tactics based on mathematical advantage rather than emotional comfort, marked Walsh as exceptional. Not all pilots could think that way. Not all leaders could recognize and promulgate such innovations. But Walsh did. And because he did, the displacement role became standard doctrine. And because it became standard doctrine, American pilots survived engagements they should have lost. The cascading effects extended across years, across squadrons, across the entire Pacific theater. One innovation, one pilot, thousands of lives saved. That's the real story of the Corsair's rolling tactics, not the aircraft's specifications, not its top speed or firepower, but the human insight that recognized how those specifications could be employed in unexpected ways. The F4U Corsair flew its final combat mission in 1969, a Honduran aircraft during the football war against El Salvador. 26 years after Walsh pioneered displacement, rolling over Guadalcanal, the aircraft evolved, tactics evolved, but the fundamental principle remained valid. Superior roll rate provided defensive advantages against opponents with slower roll rates. Modern fighter pilots flying fifth-generation aircraft still study World War II combat reports. The specifics have changed, the principles have not. Energy management, situational awareness, exploiting performance advantages, challenging conventional doctrine when mathematics suggests better approaches. These remain relevant regardless of technology. Walsh's legacy lives in those principles, not in monuments or memorials, not in dramatic retellings of individual combat missions, but in the quiet transmission of tactical knowledge from one generation of fighter pilots to the next, in the emphasis on understanding aircraft, performance characteristics, in the willingness to question doctrine and develop better approaches. That legacy is subtle. It's not captured in documentary films or popular histories. It doesn't translate to compelling narratives for general audiences. But for fighter pilots, the lesson is profound. The most effective tactics often come from operators, not designers. Understanding your tools enables innovation. Counterintuitive approaches sometimes work better than conventional wisdom. These are the lessons that keep pilots alive. These are the principles that win air battles. These are the insights that, across decades and conflicts, shape how fighters fight. Walsh's contribution to that body of knowledge deserves recognition not because it's dramatic, but because it's fundamental. The displacement role wasn't just a tactic. It was a demonstration of how operators with deep expertise can revolutionize employment of their tools. That demonstration remains relevant. That lesson endures. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.